200 motorcycles, all of them Harleys, all of them parked in front of a 71-year-old woman's house on a Tuesday morning. Engines off, riders standing still, not saying a word. The neighbors came to their windows. A few of them called 911. One woman across the street started crying, and she didn't even know why. And the retired nurse who lived in that small yellow house at the end of Birchwood Lane stood at her front door in her bathrobe, holding a mug of coffee she'd forgotten to drink, staring at 200 men and women who'd ridden through the night from 4 different states. Just for her. She didn't understand it yet. She would. But first you need to know what happened 6 weeks before that morning. What happened on a night so dark and so cold that a different kind of person would have locked the door and pretended they hadn't heard anything at all. Margaret Eleanor Voss had been a nurse for 43 years. Not the quiet administrative kind, the floor kind. The kind where you spend 12 hours on your feet, where you hold a stranger's hand while they're dying, where you learn to read a person's body the way other people read a book, in sentences, in paragraphs, in punctuation that matters. She worked emergency medicine for 30 years and then moved to hospice for the last 13 because she said, and I am quoting her exactly, that she preferred being honest with people about what was coming rather than pretending it wasn't. That's not something everyone can do. Most people can't. She could. That tells you everything you need to know about who she was before any of this happened. She retired at 68. Her knees made the decision before her mind did. They'd been carrying her through 12-hour shifts on hard hospital floors for 4 decades, and they made their position on continuing clear in the language of joints. Slowly at first, then unmistakably, then in a way that could not be argued with. She put in her notice on a Thursday. She worked her last shift on a Friday. She drove home and made dinner and did not know what to do with the silence. She was the kind of woman who had always known what to do. She moved back to Clover Falls, the small town in eastern Oregon where she'd grown up, into the house her parents had left her. A 2-story craftsman with a wraparound porch and a garden that was embarrassingly overgrown, and a roof that needed work, and a furnace that made a sound every winter like it was personally offended by the cold. It was a house that had been empty for 2 years, and a house that had been her parents' before that, and her grandparents' before that. It smelled like old wood and the particular dust of places that have not been lived in, and, underneath that, under everything, like something she didn't have a word for except home. Her husband Gerald had died 4 years earlier. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and then faster. She'd taken 3 weeks off work for it, because that's what the bereavement policy allowed, and then she'd gone back, because what else do you do when you're the kind of person who goes back? Her colleagues thought she was being strong. She was being practical. She said there was a difference. She believed it. It was mostly true. She had one daughter, Carol, who lived in Portland with 2 kids and a job that kept her busy, and the marriage that was going through something nobody discussed out loud at family dinners, which they had twice a year. They called on Sundays. It was enough, mostly. Some Sundays it was not enough at all, and Margaret sat with the phone on the kitchen counter after the call and felt the distance between Portland and Clover Falls as something physical, something that had weight. She kept herself occupied with her garden and her books and a small volunteer shift at the county clinic on Wednesday afternoons. She cooked elaborate dinners for herself and ate them at the kitchen table, reading medical journals from the past decade that she'd never had time to catch up on during the working years. She walked 2 miles every morning at 6. She knew the names of her neighbors, nodded to them, helped with the things that required help. She did not, under most circumstances, accept help back. That was the arrangement. She had maintained it for a long time. She slept well, mostly. She had a routine. She did not expect anything else to happen to her, and she was at peace with that in the way that only people who have seen enough of life's extremes can be. Not happiness exactly. Something more stable than that. Equilibrium. The night of October 14th started like every other night that October. She'd made a pot of white bean soup with sausage and kale, a recipe she'd adapted over 20 years from something her mother used to make that was originally much simpler. She'd watched exactly 40 minutes of television, which was her personal limit before she felt her brain beginning to soften at the edges. She'd read for an hour after that. She'd gone upstairs at 9:30 with the particular satisfaction of a person whose day had been used correctly. The wind had been picking up since dinner, rattling the old windows in their frames, and by 10 o'clock the rain was hitting the roof in heavy, uneven waves that had nothing polite or gradual about them. Oregon fall storms are not gentle. They don't ease in. They arrive all at once, like they've been saving up everything the season had been building toward and decided to spend it all tonight. She lay in bed and listened to the storm and thought about whether the south gutter could handle the volume, and then decided that whatever happened to the south gutter could happen to the south gutter and she would deal with it in the morning, and she was almost asleep. That's when she heard it. Not a knock exactly, more like something heavy landing against the front door. Once. Then a pause. Then again. She lay still for a moment, listening, because 43 years in emergency medicine teaches you not to move before you've gathered information. She heard it a third time. Deliberate. Slower than the first two. She got up. She pulled on the cardigan she kept on the bedpost and went downstairs without turning on many lights, which was a habit from years of walking hospital corridors at night without waking the patients. She was not afraid, exactly. She was alert. There is a difference, and she knew it. She looked through the narrow window beside the front door before she opened it, because she was a practical woman, not a foolish one. What she saw stopped her hand on the deadbolt. A man. Enormous. 6'4" at least, possibly more, built like someone had taken boulders and taught them to stand upright and then wrapped them in a soaked leather jacket. Dark hair plastered to his face by the rain, one hand pressed flat against her doorframe, the other arm pulled tight against his left side in a way that was specific and telling. He was breathing with his mouth open, which you don't do in the cold rain unless you have a reason. Even through the glass, even in the dark, she could see the way his chest was working too hard for the amount of effort he was expending just standing there. She'd seen that breathing before. She knew exactly what it meant. She opened the door. The cold came in with him, the smell of rain and wet leather and road. He was maybe 50, she thought. Hard face, the kind that had been weathered by decades of wind and sun and something else that wasn't weather. A scar that ran along his left jaw from the corner of his mouth toward his ear. Dark eyes that were working very hard right now to look fine, to look like a man who had simply stopped in for a moment out of the rain and would be on his way shortly. He was not a man accustomed to standing in doorways and needing things. There was a Harley parked crookedly at the edge of her driveway, its front wheel pressed into the grass, tilted at an angle that said it had been stopped rather than parked. He'd made it off the road. Barely. "My bike," he started. "I don't care about your bike," she said. "Come inside." He looked at her for a moment, the look of a man trying to recalibrate. She was 5'5". She was 71 years old. She was standing in her doorway in a cardigan in the middle of a rainstorm, with an expression that said she had said what she meant and did not intend to repeat it. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," she said. "I've been a nurse for 43 years, and I know what I'm looking at. Come inside, or I'll call an ambulance, and we can do this the expensive way." A pause. Long enough that she thought he might actually turn and walk back to the bike. Then, he came inside. His name was Raymond Calloway. Ray. He said it like a single syllable was all he was willing to offer, like the name was a minimum payment on a much larger debt. He sat on her kitchen chair with the careful attention of a large man in a small space, still holding his left arm close, still breathing through his mouth, still doing the thing where everything about him said he was going to be fine in a moment and didn't need any of this. She got a look at his color under the kitchen light. Not good. He'd been on his way through from Bend heading west. He'd taken a curve too fast in the rain, which was not like him, he said. And she believed him because the way he said it made clear he'd been running the incident back in his head since it happened and hadn't arrived at a satisfying explanation. The bike had gone down on a patch of gravel he hadn't seen in the dark. He'd gone with it and then separated from it, which was the better outcome of the two available. He'd gotten up, walked the bike to the shoulder with difficulty, realized his breathing wasn't right, realized he wasn't getting back on the bike tonight, regardless of anything else. He'd seen her porch light from the road. "Show me," she said, nodding at his side. "It's nothing." "Ray." She used his name the way she'd used the names of patients for 40 years. Not soft, not harsh, completely certain. The voice that said, "I have done this 10,000 times and we are not going to waste each other's time." "Show me." He unzipped the leather jacket with difficulty. The motion alone told her something. The left side of his torso, from his lower ribs upward, was a color that had no business being on a living person. Deep purple at the center darkening toward black, the edges bleeding into yellow-green. It was fresh, maybe 2 hours old. The impact had been significant, and when she pressed 2 careful fingers just below his ribs, he pulled a breath in through his teeth that answered the question she'd been building toward. Broken ribs. At minimum 2. The question she now needed to answer was whether they'd done anything on their way in. "Does it hurt when you breathe all the way in? Full breath?" He tried. She watched him stop short of full expansion. "Sharp," he said. "Left side." "Worse than when you first got off the bike?" He thought about it honestly, which told her he was paying attention. "About the same, maybe a little better." She stood straight and did the full assessment in her head. She was listening for the sound she didn't want to hear. She was looking at the rise and fall of his chest for the asymmetry she didn't want to see. She was cataloging everything available. The good news: no obvious pneumothorax developing in the last 2 hours. His color was bad but not deteriorating. He was lucid and responsive and tracking the conversation. The bad news: rib fractures in a man this size with a fresh impact trauma were a 12-hour watch at minimum. Pneumothorax was not a thing you caught in the afternoon. It was a thing you caught at 3 in the morning when someone stopped being able to breathe and you had 15 minutes before it became unsurvivable without intervention. 40 minutes to the nearest hospital in this rain. She was not going to send him out into that. "You're staying," she said. "I don't need..." "You need observation, and you need your ribs taped, and you need someone who knows what they're looking for to check on you every 90 minutes. You can be stubborn about it tomorrow when your lungs have had a night to stay intact. Tonight, you stay." She was already moving toward the cabinet where she kept the first aid kit that was more comprehensive than most household first aid kits because she had never been able to train herself out of keeping supplies. "Are you hungry?" The pause that meant yes. "There's soup on the stove. Help yourself, I'll be back." She came back with a kit that included, among other things, elastic bandaging that she'd used for exactly this purpose before, and techniques she'd learned in the years when the ER was full on Friday nights, and you worked with what you had. He'd found the soup and was standing at the stove with a bowl, eating it standing up, which she corrected. "Sit down." "I can eat standing." "Sitting puts less pressure on your diaphragm. Sit down." He sat. She taped his ribs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times, guiding his breathing through the process, noting his pain responses, adjusting her pressure accordingly. He was stoic about it in the particular way of men who have had worse and have learned to keep the score to themselves. She asked questions, and he answered them, and somewhere in the middle of it, the kitchen took on the quality that hospital rooms sometimes took on late at night, when the noise dropped away, and there were just 2 people on either side of a medical situation being honest with each other about what it was. "Where were you heading?" she asked. "Just west. No specific destination tonight." "Anyone expecting you somewhere?" "No." She taped the last section and cut it clean. "Then you're staying." He looked at her. His expression had shifted slightly from the controlled nothing of before. He was recalibrating again, like a man who had walked in expecting a transaction and found himself in something else. "I'll pay for the trouble," he said. "You will not," she said, in a tone that foreclosed further discussion. She set him up on the pull-out couch in the downstairs study with a spare blanket and a glass of water and a strict set of instructions. Call out if anything changed about his breathing. Don't lie flat if he could avoid it. Don't try to cough or clear his throat forcefully. come get her if there was any new sharp pain or if he felt short of breath at rest. He looked at the list she'd said out loud like it was longer than expected. I'll check on you every 90 minutes, she said. You don't have to do that. I'm aware, she said. I'll do it anyway. Good night. She left the door open and she set an alarm on her phone for every 90 minutes, and she settled in the armchair in the hallway outside the study with a book she didn't read, and she listened to the storm and to the sound of his breathing down the hall. Rain against the windows. The old house settling in the wind. His breathing, steady, audible, not labored. She counted intervals without realizing she was doing it. Old habit. The body keeps its professional rhythms long after the profession ends. Every 90 minutes, she got up and walked to the door and listened, and sometimes spoke quietly, and he answered, and she went back to the chair. The third time she came in, he was sitting up, which wasn't what she'd prescribed, but his color had improved, and his breathing was even, and she let it go. You were military, she said, not a question. Marines, long time ago. Where? Mosul first, Fallujah second tour. He shifted carefully. You're going to ask what that was like. No, she said. I worked ER in Portland for 12 years. I have some idea what that's like. He studied her for a moment. Your husband? Army, Korea era. He didn't talk about it either. She sat in the second chair, the small one near the bookshelf. He used to say the people who talked the most were the ones who'd seen the least. I never knew if that was true or if it was just a reason he'd made peace with. Both, probably, Ray said. The storm had dropped to something lower and steadier. The house had settled into its nighttime sounds, the specific quiet of an old structure that knows how to hold weather. You have family? She asked. She asked it the way she'd asked 1,000 patients, not intrusive, just present. Daughter, he said. Sophie, Spokane. He paused. We talk more than we used to, less than I'd like. How old is she? 24. Something moved across his face, not grief exactly, more like the particular ache of time. She was 11 when her mother died. I handled it the way I handle most things. He left it there. She understood. What does that mean, she said, for you? Forward, fast, loud, he looked at the ceiling. Not in the house much, not present even when I was. She was better off with her grandparents for a while, and I told myself that was the right call, and mostly I think it was. He paused. I'm not sure what the right call would have looked like from the inside, though. I just know what the wrong ones felt like. Margaret was quiet. Outside, a branch scraped against the side of the house. My husband was the one who knew how to be present, she said. I was the one who was always somewhere else, professionally. He kept the house running. He kept Carol's life together. He was patient about all of it in a way I didn't understand until he was gone. She looked at her hands. I think I thanked him about once every 3 years. I thought the marriage was the thank you, that showing up every day was the equivalent of saying it. Was he happy? She considered it seriously. I think so. He said so. I believed him. She paused. I wish I'd asked more. The lamp in the corner of the study threw a small circle of yellow light. The rain was almost done. You could hear the change in it, the way the intervals between drops grew longer. Why did you open the door? Ray asked. She looked at him. You were knocking. A lot of people wouldn't. A lot of people don't see what I see when they look at someone standing in the rain, she said. I've been looking at people who need help for 43 years. It's not something I can turn off. She paused. I'm not sure I want to. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you see? When I look at you? Yeah. She thought about it honestly, the way she always answered real questions. A man who spent a long time being the one who doesn't need anything, who built that into his identity the way some people build their careers into theirs, and who, tonight, needed something and knocked anyway. She met his eyes. That took more out of you than the ribs did. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away at the bookshelf. Get some sleep, she said. I'll be back at 5. She went back to her chair. He was asleep before 4. His breathing was clean and steady, and she let herself close her eyes for the first time since 10 o'clock. The last of the rain moved east over the mountains. By the time the light started coming in through the windows, Birchwood Lane was quiet, and the puddles in the driveway were reflecting a pale gray sky, and the Harley was sitting at the edge of the grass, catching the early light on its chrome the way bikes do in the morning, like they're storing it. She made coffee. She made eggs. She scrambled them with sharp cheddar and chives from the garden, because she had them, and because there was no reason to make bad eggs. She made enough for two. He sat at the kitchen table in the morning light, looking marginally less like a man who might have a medical emergency than he had 8 hours ago, which she considered a professional success. He ate everything she put in front of him in the methodical way of someone who has learned not to be precious about food. She watched him do the math in his head, the particular long division of a man who wants to say thank you and does not have the right language for it. "I've got a guy in Bend who can come get the bike," he said finally. "I called already," she said. He looked up. "The number was on a sticker on the frame," she said, entirely without apology. "Sunrise Power Sports. They open at 9. I called at 8:30 and left a message." He put down his fork. He stared at her. "You've been up since what?" 4, she said. "Earlier, technically. I checked on you at 2:30 and 3:45. You said every 90 minutes. You were asleep. I adjusted the schedule." Something in his expression shifted. It was not a large shift. It was the kind of shift that happens in people who have spent a long time not being taken care of, and who do not, in the moment it happens, entirely know what to do with the sensation. He picked up his fork again. He finished his eggs. "I don't know how to," he started. "You don't have to," she said. "That's the thing about it. You don't owe me anything." He looked at her for a long time across the kitchen table. The morning light was doing that thing it does in October in Oregon when the storm is past and the air is clean and everything looks like it was recently washed. His leather jacket was hung over the back of the other chair. His boots were by the door. He looked, in this light, in this kitchen, like a man who had been somewhere difficult for a very long time and had sat down by accident. "I'm going to send you something," he said. "You don't need to." "Margaret." He used her full name, which she'd given him somewhere around 2 in the morning when he'd asked it in that quiet way people ask things when they're trying to stay anchored to the ordinary. He used her full name with a weight that surprised her, like he was placing it carefully. "I'm going to send you something. Don't argue with me about it." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. The truck from Sunrise Power Sports arrived at 9:15. 2 guys in a flatbed, efficient and cheerful in the way of people who do this regularly, who loaded the Harley with practiced care while Ray stood on the lawn and watched with his arms crossed and the specific expression of a man watching someone else handle something that matters to him. He answered their questions about the damage. He signed the paperwork. He spoke on his phone briefly, his back half turned, his voice low. Before he climbed in the cab, he came back to where Margaret was standing on the porch. He stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her. She was not a tall woman, he was. "You probably saved my life last night," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "Most people wouldn't have opened the door." "Most people don't know what to look for," she paused. "You'll want to see a doctor when you get back. The ribs need imaging to confirm what I think I know. Don't put it off." "Yes, ma'am." The corner of her mouth moved. He shook her hand. Formal, almost ceremonial. Then he got in the truck, and the truck pulled out of the driveway, and she watched it go down Birchwood Lane until the sound of the engine faded into the general sound of morning. She went back inside. She washed the breakfast dishes. She watered her plants. She looked at the spot on the kitchen floor where the Harley's pooled water had dried into a faint, irregular ring that she would mop up later. And she thought about Gerald and about whether this was the kind of story he would have liked. She decided he would have. He liked stories about people being decent to each other when they didn't have to be. He'd have asked her a dozen questions about Ray Calloway. She would have told him all of it over dinner, and he would have listened the way he listened to everything, completely, like it was the most interesting story he'd ever heard. And she would have finished, and he would have said, "So what happens next?" She didn't know. That was the answer. She never did. She didn't think about it again until 3 days later when the bank notification came. She was standing at the kitchen counter when her phone buzzed. It was a banking app notification, the kind she'd set up at Carol's insistence and then largely ignored. She looked at it. It didn't make immediate sense, so she called the branch, which was her way of handling things that didn't make immediate sense. The woman at the branch read her the transaction twice. Margaret asked her to read it a third time. Payment received. Account brought current. The overdue amount on the mortgage. All of it. $14,642. In full. She stood in her kitchen for a long time after she hung up the phone. The soup pot was on the shelf. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window, the same light that had been there the morning Ray Calloway ate eggs at her table. She stood and looked at her kitchen and thought about what she was feeling, which was a complicated set of things she did not usually spend much time cataloging. Relief, obviously. The mortgage had been the low-grade specific dread that had been living in her chest for 8 months, since Gerald's last set of medical bills had finally completed their tour through the insurance system and landed, reduced but still significant, in her mailbox. Medical bills, she knew from her professional life, did not care how much you'd given to medicine. They came regardless. She'd made arrangements, she'd managed. But managing a debt of that size on a fixed income at 71 has a particular flavor that doesn't go away in the daytime. It lives in you. It woke her up some mornings between 3 and 4. She hadn't told anyone about it, not Carol, who would have insisted on something Margaret didn't want. Not Ruth at the clinic. Not anyone. You don't when you've spent your life being the person other people lean on. There is a particular and very specific loneliness in being competent. People assume you're fine. They assume it because you've always been fine, because you've always handled things, because you have not built into your relationships the habit of being the one who needs. And you let them assume it, mostly, because the alternative requires a kind of vulnerability that is genuinely difficult if your entire identity is built around showing up. Someone she'd known for one night in a rainstorm had seen something she hadn't said, and had fixed it without asking permission, without making it a debt, without attaching a story to it. She sat down at the kitchen table. She thought about that for a long time. Then she went back to her garden, which was the thing she did when she needed to think without thinking. Now I need to tell you what was happening on Ray's end, because that's where this story becomes something larger than 2 people and a kitchen table. He'd gone back to Bend. His ribs were going to take 6 weeks, and he knew it, and he was annoyed about it in the reflexive way of a man who treats his own body as infrastructure that's supposed to function without complaint. He ran a detail shop and customization bay that he'd been building for 11 years, a legitimate business with 4 full-time employees and a reputation for quality that had taken a decade to earn and that he'd have burned to the ground before he compromised it. It was also, incidentally, the official base of operations for the Bend chapter of the Iron Congregation MC. The Iron Congregation had been around for 23 years, 15 active members in the Bend chapter, not a large club, the kind that has long since passed the point of needing to be loud about what it is. The kind where the members are in their 40s and 50s, where most of them have day jobs and families, where the bikes are the thing that holds the shape of the thing they'd been when they were younger and harder to manage. Mechanics and contractors and one high school history teacher named Pete, who nobody outside the club would have guessed rode a 1979 shovelhead to work every spring and fall. A retired firefighter, a woman named Rose who'd spent 15 years as a paramedic and now ran a dog rescue that was probably the most effective charitable operation in Deschutes County. Ray had been the president for 9 years. He hadn't run for the position. He'd been asked because of the particular combination of qualities that make someone trusted in those rooms. He kept his word without being asked to. He solved problems without creating new ones, and he was the kind of person who thought about consequences before he moved, which is rarer than it should be. He told the story to the club at the following Wednesday meeting. He told it the way he told everything, straight, in sequence, without embellishment. Rain, bike, door, woman, the nursing, the tape job, the 90-minute checks, the eggs at 8 in the morning, the phone call she'd made to the shop before he was even awake, The mortgage, which he'd paid 3 days after he got back to Bend, which he told them about because there was no point in not. The room was quiet when he finished. Then Diesel, his VP, who had been riding with Ray for 20 years and who had a specific face for moments when Ray was doing the technically correct thing while missing the larger point, said, "She doesn't know it was you. She knows someone did it. She doesn't know who. She can figure it out." "Ray," Diesel set his coffee down, "you paid $14,000 to a woman you met once, and you consider that the conversation finished. It's handled." That is not what any version of handled looks like. Diesel paused. "Tell us about her again." So Ray told them again, not the medical parts this time, the parts he'd been carrying without realizing he was carrying them. The way she'd said "you don't have to" when he tried to explain. The way she'd sat in an armchair all night in the hallway and then made breakfast like it was nothing, because to her, it was nothing. That was just what you did. That was just what people were supposed to be for each other. The 43 years. The dead husband she'd talked about at 2 in the morning, like she was still having the conversation she'd wanted to have with him while he was alive. Nobody spoke for a moment when he finished. Then Thorne, the oldest member, who was 64 and had been writing since 1978, and who had used up all of his unnecessary words decades ago, and now operated with the economy of someone who understood that silence was not dead air, but space for things to settle, said, "What does she need?" Ray looked at him. "Beyond the mortgage," Thorne said. "What does she actually need?" And that was the question that changed the scale of everything. Because Ray had noticed. In the way that you notice things you're not consciously deciding to catalog when you're a man who runs a maintenance-adjacent business and who has lived his entire adult life paying attention to the material condition of things. The south-facing shingles on the roof had been visibly deteriorating since before she moved back into the house. He'd seen the gap in the fascia board above the kitchen window at first light, obvious in the morning horizontal light that makes every imperfection clear. He'd seen the side porch where 2 deck boards had rotted through and been covered with a sheet of plywood that was itself beginning to separate. He'd seen the furnace intake housing on the side of the house, cracked at the base in a way that would let cold air in all winter. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was the kind of deferred maintenance that accumulates in a house that's been empty, that belongs to someone who has been spending their resources elsewhere, who is too proud to ask and too practical to pretend it isn't there. He laid it out for the club: the roofing, the porch, the fascia, the furnace housing. The room was quiet again, different kind of quiet. Rose spoke first. "What are we thinking?" "I don't know yet," Ray said. "I'm thinking." "I know a roofing crew in Eugene," said a man named Cartwright, who'd done construction for 15 years before he'd ended up in bikes and then found his way back to construction. "Good people. Did the work on the Portland chapter's clubhouse 2 years ago. Clean, fast, don't ask questions." "How much material?" Diesel asked. Cartwright started running numbers in his head. "South-facing, size of that roof. Probably not that much. New fascia's easy. The porch is an afternoon if you've got the lumber. The furnace housing you can get at any supply place," said Pete, who had an encyclopedic and largely inexplicable knowledge of HVAC systems for a history teacher. "Half a day, maybe less." "She won't want this," Ray said. "No," Thorne said, "she won't. That's not the relevant question." "What is?" Thorne looked at him. "Does she need it?" The room was quiet for a moment. "Yes," Ray said. "Then we do it." What happened next happened the way things happen in tightly knit groups that have been together long enough to understand each other. Fast, without a lot of words. Diesel called the Portland chapter that night. 22 members. He didn't explain much. He said, "Ray's telling a story at the next meeting you're going to want to hear in person. Be there or I'll tell it to you wrong." The Portland chapter sent 12 people to the Bend meeting the following week. Ray told the story once more. The materials list was on the board behind him. The work schedule was on the board next to it. 12 hands went up before he was done talking. Rose had already been making calls. She'd reached the Salem chapter, 8 members. She'd reached the chapter in Medford, small but with 3 construction professionals who had been, between them, 56 years in the trades. She'd reached a chapter in Seattle she knew from a ride 2 years ago, people she trusted. The message that went out was not a formal request. It wasn't a mandate. It was closer to a story that someone told someone else, who told someone else. And the story was simple. There's a woman in Clover Falls who sat up all night checking a stranger's breathing, because that's who she is, and that's what she does. And she has a roof that needs fixing, and a porch that needs work, and a furnace housing that's going to make this winter harder than it needs to be. And we are going to go say thank you in the only language that actually means something. The response was not something Ray anticipated. People who'd heard the story from 3 removes wanted to come. People who had no construction skills and knew it wanted to come anyway. People from chapters he'd never met, who had somehow heard it through the linked network of groups, wanted to come. He started getting calls from people in Washington, then Idaho, then a chapter in Northern California. He had a spreadsheet within a week. He had never in his life kept a spreadsheet, and he was now keeping one at midnight because the numbers had gotten too large to hold in his head. 2 days before the scheduled date, he had confirmed 207 riders from 11 different chapters and 3 independent clubs who'd heard through the network and asked if it was all right if they came. He said yes. He did not tell Margaret. Part of that was tactical. If you tell a woman like Margaret Voss that 200 motorcycles are coming to fix her house, she will spend the next 5 days telling you it's not necessary, and she's fine. And truly you shouldn't, and she means it. Part of it was something else. A feeling he had, which he wouldn't have called that out loud, that the thing would mean what it was supposed to mean only if it arrived whole. Unannounced. Real. The roofing crew drove up from Eugene the night before and parked outside of town and waited. The lumber and materials were in 2 trucks that staged at a rest stop 8 miles from Clover Falls. The work teams had their assignments. Cartwright had coordinated it the way he coordinated job sites, which was with the kind of calm authority that comes from 20 years of making complex things happen on schedule. On Tuesday morning, the riders began arriving in Clover Falls from 3 different directions. 2 by 2, in the formation that comes naturally to people who've ridden together long enough that it's not a decision, it's just what happens. Coming down Birchwood Lane. Margaret Voss was in her garden at 7:45 in the morning. She was doing the work of late October, which is the work of closing things down, of cutting back, of preparing for the cold in the way that gardens require. She heard it before she understood it. A low sound from the direction of the main road, getting louder, getting much louder. A sound that was not weather and was not traffic in any normal sense of the word. She stood up from the garden bed and looked through the gap in the hedge. She saw the lights first, dozens of headlights coming down the lane, then more. She walked to the front of the house. She stood on her porch in her bathrobe with her coffee mug, and she watched them come down Birchwood Lane, 2 by 2, filling the road from curb to curb, pulling in front of her house and along the curb in both directions, engines cutting off one at a time from the front backward until the sound dropped away in a wave. The silence that replaced it was the loudest kind. 207 motorcycles parked on Birchwood Lane, 207 people standing beside them. And the roofing trucks pulling up now, and the lumber truck, and somewhere down the line the supply van with the furnace housing and the deck boards. Mrs. Patrice Wynn from across the street called 911. She said later she didn't know why, that it just seemed like the thing to do when 200 motorcycles appeared on your street at 8 in the morning. The dispatcher, who had grown up in Clover Falls and knew roughly everyone, asked her to describe the situation. She described it. There was a pause. The dispatcher said, "Ma'am, do they appear to be doing anything?" She said, "They're just standing there." He said, "Then they're probably fine." He said it with the tone of someone who had just understood something she hadn't. Margaret didn't recognize the face until he came through the gap in the crowd, moving with the specific careful uprightness of a man protecting recently healed ribs. Different from the night she'd last seen him, more color, less strain. Ray Calloway stopped at the bottom of her porch steps. "I said I'd send something," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the people behind him. She looked at the trucks and the lumber and the roofing crew who were already, without waiting for anything, beginning to unload equipment with a cheerful professionalism that said they had places to be and work to do. "This is excessive," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She looked out at all of them again. A woman near the back had her hand over her mouth. An older man toward the middle, white beard, leather vest covered in patches, was standing with his arms crossed and a private smile like a man watching something he expected to be exactly what it was and was. Two kids, maybe 7 and 9, had appeared from somewhere in the crowd and were looking at the bikes with the particular helpless awe that children have around large machines. "You didn't have to do this," Margaret said. "We know," Ray said. "That's the point." She looked at him for a moment. And then she did what he'd been waiting for her to do, which was not cry, because she was not a crying woman, and not make a speech, because she was not a speech woman, but just to stand there on her porch in the morning light and let it arrive. All of it. The full weight of 200 people who had ridden from across 3 states for a 71-year-old retired nurse on a Tuesday morning. Let herself feel what it was. Not excessive and not overwhelming and not charity. Just the world, for once, giving back in the direction it usually only takes from. She had spent 43 years being the person who shows up. She had not, until this moment, understood what it would feel like to be the one people show up for. She stood on her porch for a long moment. "Well," she said finally, "I'd better make more coffee." The sound that came back from the crowd was not quite a cheer and not quite a laugh and was somehow both. The specific sound of a large group of people releasing something they'd been holding. And then the work began. Before I tell you what those 2 days looked like, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city in the comments right now, because I want to know how far this story is traveling. There's something at the end of this I want you to know. Something that I think is going to stay with you, and it matters more if I know who's in the room. Put your city in the comments. I'll be here at the end. They worked for 2 days. The roofing crew went up on the first morning with the particular efficiency of professionals who have done this long enough that the choreography is automatic. By noon, the old shingles were off the south face. By 4 in the afternoon, the new ones were going on, Cartwright calling measurements from the ridge. 2 of his guys moving in the steady rhythm of men who have worked together enough to not need words for the technical parts. By nightfall, the south face was complete, sealed, and the fascia board above the kitchen window was out and replaced and painted. Margaret stood in the driveway at 4:30 and watched them work and asked Cartwright 3 questions about his flashing technique that he answered with the slight surprise of a man who does not often get technical questions from the homeowners he works for. She had an opinion about the overlap. She expressed it. He listened. He adjusted. It was better her way. The deck crew replaced the side porch boards with 2x6s and reinforced the joists beneath them, which had been softening longer than the surface suggested. Margaret chose the stain color herself, a deep gray-green that matched the original color of the porch from 1987, which she knew because she'd been 14 in 1987, and she remembered the color the way you remember specific things from childhood that you didn't know you were memorizing. Hector, who had done HVAC for 22 years before he'd ended up in bikes and construction, replaced the furnace housing in an afternoon and explained the repair in full to Margaret while he worked, because she stood there watching and asked him questions about the mechanics of it, with the kind of specific technical curiosity that made him realize, about 15 minutes in, that she knew considerably more about the physics of the situation than the average homeowner. He adjusted his explanations accordingly. She appreciated it. She told him so. There were smaller things that added up across the 2 days in the way of large groups working in a focused space. Someone noticed the gutters were pulling away from the fascia on the north side and fixed them without mentioning it. Someone replaced the cracked bottom step at the back entrance that she'd been stepping around for a year. Someone recaulked the kitchen window that had been letting in a thin, cold draft all October, which nobody had told them about, but which you could see from outside if you pressed your hand to the frame in the right light. 3 women who'd come up from Medford spent most of a day in the garden, working methodically through Margaret's direction, clearing the heavy autumn work she hadn't been able to manage alone since her knees started disagreeing with sustained crouching. Margaret was in the middle of all of it, not watching, directing. She had views about the sequence of the deckwork and where the lumber scrap should be staged, and the correct way to handle the disposal of the old roofing material, and she expressed them clearly and without apology. The crews listened. When she was right, which happened more often than they'd initially expected, given that she was a retired nurse and not a construction professional, they adjusted. When she was wrong, they said so, and she listened, and they moved on. It was efficient in the way that things are efficient when people are paying attention. On the second evening, someone set up a long folding table in the backyard. Nobody had organized it. It just happened, the way things happen when large groups of people have been working hard, and the sun is going down, and the temperature is dropping, and there is a yard available. People brought food from the trucks and from the coolers that had appeared during the day, and from somewhere a large pot of chili materialized that nobody later could identify the origin of, but which was, by general agreement, excellent. It became something nobody had planned. A dinner on a Tuesday evening, in a yard with sawdust still in the air, and the smell of new wood and new shingles, and the particular warm tiredness of people who have worked hard together on something that mattered. The sky went from orange to red to the deep blue that October skies do in Oregon when they're clear, which they were, finally, after 2 weeks of rain. Margaret sat at the end of the table next to Thorne, who was the oldest member and who turned out, in the way that people turn out at dinners when you're actually talking to them, to have a passionate and extensively informed opinion about Francis Ford Coppola. Specifically, they argued about The Conversation, 1974, Gene Hackman, whether it was underrated or merely correctly rated. Margaret said underrated. Thorne said correctly rated, and that there was a meaningful difference between a film being overlooked by the mainstream and a film being misunderstood, and the former was not automatically the latter. Margaret said the distinction mattered less than he was suggesting. They argued about it for 20 minutes while the dinner swirled around them, and it was one of the best 20 minutes Margaret Voss had spent in longer than she could easily remember. Ray sat 3 seats down and watched her argue with Thorne and felt something uncomplicated settle in his chest. The satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Not done big, not done for show. Done in the way that things matter when they're done with care and attention and the right amount of scale. Carol called that evening, 8:30. Margaret was still in the backyard. A neighbor 2 houses down had posted a photograph on the town Facebook group, the motorcycles on Birchwood Lane in the morning light, and it had traveled to Portland in the way that things travel. Carol called in the compressed emotional state that comes out as rapid questions when you're a person who processes anxiety through logistics. Margaret went inside to answer it. She was patient. She answered everything. "Mom," Carol said after the questions ran out, "why didn't you tell me about the mortgage?" A pause. "Because you had enough going on," Margaret said. "That is not, you can't just, I'm your daughter." "Carol, I could have helped." "I know," Margaret said, "and someday I will probably let you help with something. But this wasn't it, and it's handled now." Silence. "Are you okay?" Carol asked. The question stripped down, finally, to what it was. "I have a new porch," Margaret said, "and a new roof, and there are 200 people in my backyard eating chili. I'm genuinely better than okay." A pause on the other end of the line. "I want to come see you," Carol said. "Next month," Margaret said. "The garden will need putting to bed for winter. You can help with that and bring the kids." Carol laughed. It was a slightly wet laugh. "Okay," she said. "Next month." Margaret went back out to the backyard where Thorne was now holding court on the subject of Hitchcock, and someone had produced a bottle of whiskey that was going around the table, and the evening had the quality of evenings that happen when the work is done and the people are good and nobody has anywhere to be. Now let me tell you something that most people don't hear in this story because it happened quietly. 3 weeks after the motorcycles went home. This is the part that matters most. This is the part I want you to be watching for. Margaret got a phone call from a woman named Darcy Hutchins in Salem. Darcy had heard the story through her cousin, who was connected to the Salem chapter. She called the number she'd been given for Margaret, which was Margaret's actual cell number because Rose had given it out when someone asked, with Margaret's prior knowledge after confirming she was willing to receive calls. Darcy's brother's name was Travis. He was 31 years old. He'd done 2 tours with the Army, one in Afghanistan, one in Iraq. He'd come home 14 months ago. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't talking. He had a medical situation that he wouldn't address because he didn't trust hospitals, which his family understood in the abstract but couldn't find a way through. He'd been declining, slowly and then less slowly, and Darcy had been watching it and making calls to VA offices that went nowhere, and talking to doctors who said the right things and couldn't reach him. And she was frightened, in the specific way of someone who can see what's coming and cannot stop the approach. She didn't know who to call. Someone had given her Margaret's number and said, "Just call her." She called her. Margaret listened to the whole thing on her kitchen phone, standing at the counter with a notepad in her hand. She asked questions. Darcy answered them. Margaret asked more questions, medical ones. Then some that weren't strictly medical, but that were the kind you asked when you were building a picture of a person from the outside. "What does he respond to?" she asked. "When he's willing to talk, what does he talk about?" "Cars," Darcy said, without hesitating. "He's always been into cars. He used to rebuild them. He stopped when he got back, but he still talks about engines when something comes up." Margaret wrote it down. She looked at what she'd written. "Okay," she said. "Okay what?" Darcy asked. "Give me a few days," Margaret said. "I'm going to make a call." She called Ray. She hadn't called him before. She'd had a sense, from the way he'd told her he'd send something, that the number she had for the bike shop was one he'd use. She was right. He picked up on the second ring. She told him about Travis. Straight, in sequence, without embellishment. The tours, the medical situation, the cars. There was a pause. "How old did you say he is?" Ray said. 31. Another pause. "I know a guy," Ray said. "Former Marine, runs a shop in Salem, lost his partner last year, has been looking for someone to take on, someone he could work with who understood what the silence feels like." He paused again. "It's not a cure. It's not therapy." "No," Margaret said, "but it's a place to put your hands on something and make it work. Sometimes that comes first." "Yeah," Ray said. "Sometimes it does." 3 weeks later, Travis Hutchins showed up at a garage in Salem to help strip a 1968 Mustang that a former Marine named Dean needed another set of hands on. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He didn't talk much for the first 2 weeks. Dean didn't require it. They worked. Margaret heard this from Darcy, who called every 10 days or so with updates that got incrementally better in the way that things get better when they're actually getting better rather than when you're hoping they are. Travis had started sleeping more. Travis had talked to a VA counselor once, which was once more than before. Travis had laughed at something Dean said about a carburetor. Small things, the only kind that matter. That's the part of the story that doesn't fit in the headline. 200 motorcycles is the headline. Margaret standing on her porch in her bathrobe is the image. But the actual story, the story that keeps going after the cameras go home, is a phone call to a retired nurse who knew a guy who knew a guy, and the 31-year-old veteran in a garage in Salem with his hands on a 1968 Mustang, and the specific, quiet, non-dramatic process of a person finding their way back into the world. Margaret made the call because that's who she was. Because she'd heard something in Darcy's voice that she recognized from 43 years of being the person people called when they didn't know who else to call. And because she had, by then, a network she hadn't had before. A set of people who answered when she called, who knew people, who connected things. The Iron Congregation, for reasons having to do with their history and their values, and also, frankly, their practical experience of what it meant to try to come back from difficult things, had been quietly involved in veteran transition support for several years in Central and Eastern Oregon. Nothing formal, nothing with a logo, just we know people and people know us, and when something needs connecting, we connect it. They connected Travis. He's still working at the garage. He got his own place 6 months in. He calls Darcy on Sundays. He started going to a peer support group on Thursday evenings that he found through a connection from Dean. He is not fixed, because that is not how any of this works. He is better. He is present. He is, most days, facing forward. Margaret knows this. She gets updates from Darcy. She doesn't take credit for it. If you asked her about it, she would say, "I made one phone call. All I did was make one phone call." And that is technically accurate, and also misses everything. Because the phone call was the door, and she opened it the same way she opened all the doors. Because someone needed something, and she could help. And that was the complete equation. Let me tell you why I think that equation is the whole point. We have spent a long time being told, in 1,000 different ways and through 1,000 different channels, that the right approach to your limited time and your limited energy and your limited emotional resources is to be selective, to protect yourself, to be strategic about where you invest and careful about who you open yourself to. And there is truth in this, real and legitimate truth, because care is a finite resource and its depletion is real, and the people who spend themselves recklessly often end up with nothing to give. But there is something this advice does not account for. Something Margaret knew, not as a theory, but as an observed clinical fact after 43 years at the bedside. The people who arrive at the end of their lives most intact are not the ones who protected the most carefully. They're the ones who gave with the grain of who they were, consistently, without keeping the score, who trusted that the supply would meet the demand if they stayed true to the impulse. She had watched people die who had spent their lives calculating and arrived at the end with their resources carefully preserved and something depleted in them that wasn't financial, wasn't physical, was harder to describe than either. A kind of interior narrowing. Like they had spent their energy keeping themselves small enough to maintain and lost, in the process, the capacity for the size of thing they'd actually been capable of. And she had watched others. The ones who came to the end expanded, who had grown into the size of their own generosity over the decades, and found in the end that there was more room in them than they'd ever known, who had given away enormous amounts and were, somehow, full. She had a very specific idea of how she wanted to die. She had decided it quietly and without drama, sometime in her late 50s, and had not deviated from it. She opened the door, and 200 people showed up in the morning light. And a woman in Salem got to hear her brother laugh at something about a carburetor. And a house on Birchwood Lane is tight and whole and ready for whatever winter comes. Now, here's what I want to ask you before you go. Somewhere between where you started watching this and where you are right now, something shifted. I know it did, because I've seen these comments for long enough to know what stories do to people. And I know this one in particular, because it's the kind of story that reaches something people have been carrying for a while without knowing it was weight. The question it leaves you with is not complicated. It's not philosophical. It's actually embarrassingly simple. It is there a door you haven't been opening? Not a big door, not a life-changing one, the small one. The one you passed this morning, the colleague who's been quieter than usual, the neighbor you've been meaning to check on, the person you know who is very good at being fine, who you've been taking at face value because it's easier and because they seem like they have it handled, the call you've been putting off because the conversation might be hard. You know which door I'm talking about. You thought of it just now. Margaret would tell you, you already know what to do. You don't need a blueprint. You need to do the thing you know to do. That's the whole story. That's always been the whole story. The porch light is on. You know where the door is. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me if this found something in you. Tell me about a Margaret in your life. Tell me about a door you're going to open tomorrow. And if you want to stay in the world of these stories a little longer, because I know some of you do, there's a story on this channel about a little girl who knew Morse code and a diner on a rainy highway and 3 bikers who followed a van into the dark. There's a story about an 8-year-old boy who ran barefoot into the road and the 8 riders who followed him down a dirt path into the trees. There's a story about a soldier's last promise, and 600 miles of desert road, and 97 engines roaring to life at dawn. Every one of them is the same story Margaret's story is. Every one of them is about a door and the decision to open it. They're waiting for you. Go find them, and when you go home tonight, listen. You might hear something on the other side. Open the door. The morning after, Margaret Voss got up at 6:30 and made coffee and went out to her new porch in the early October cold and stood there with her mug and looked at Birchwood Lane. Entirely quiet now, empty and leaf-blown and gold in the early light. Like nothing had happened. Except the porch was solid under her feet, and the gutters were straight, and the roof was tight above her, and the furnace had run all night without the thin, cold whistle she'd been living with. She was going to call Carol before Sunday. She'd decided that sometime during the dinner, without knowing she'd decided it until she noticed it was decided. She went inside. She got out her notepad from the previous evening, Travis's name on it, the things Darcy had told her. She looked at it and thought about what she knew and what the next step was, which was how she had approached every problem for 43 years. She picked up the phone. The morning light came through the kitchen window, straight and clean, the way it comes after a storm has passed and the air is washed. She dialed. The phone rang twice. She started talking. Some stories end with the motorcycles. This one started there. There is something I haven't told you about the days after Ray went back to Bend that matters to understanding what happened next. He called Sophie. He called her on a Thursday evening, which was not their usual day and not a special occasion. And when she answered with the slight wariness that comes from off-schedule calls from parents, he said, "I just wanted to hear how the promotion was going. Are you eating well up there?" She laughed. He could hear in the laugh that she was surprised and that she was trying not to show it and that she was pleased. They talked for 40 minutes. She told him about the new team and the project and the coworker she was still figuring out. He asked questions that were actually questions, rather than the kind of questions that are really just holding space while you wait for your turn to talk. He had been practicing this, quietly, without a name for it, since a conversation at 2 in the morning in a house in Clover Falls. When he hung up, he stood in the kitchen for a moment. He thought about Margaret Voss washing her breakfast dishes. He thought about the particular way she said the things she said. The world is full of people standing in the rain knocking on doors. He wasn't sure she'd said exactly that. He might have constructed the sentence from what she'd meant. Either way, he had it. He called Sophie again the following week, and the week after that. Not because anything was wrong, because he wanted to. Because it turned out that wanting to and doing it were not as far apart as he'd let them become, and that the distance between them was mostly habit and not architecture, and that habits could change. This isn't a side note. This is part of the same story, the same chain. Margaret sat up all night for a stranger and made him breakfast and didn't make it into a transaction. And that stranger went home and called his daughter and meant it, and that is not nothing. That is exactly the thing. That's what happens when you open a door without keeping the score. The effect travels further than you can see. It moves in directions you can't track. It doesn't announce itself, it just goes. When Thorne asked what she needed, Ray had already been carrying the answer for a week without naming it. He'd been driving past hardware stores and noting prices on shingles in a vague background way that he recognized, after a few days, as planning rather than observation. He'd been doing the square footage in his head of a roof he'd seen for exactly 10 minutes in October dawn light. He couldn't have told you when he'd decided. He didn't think of it as a decision. He thought of it as a thing that was obviously going to happen, the way you think of gravity. Thorne's question just gave it a schedule. The club meeting where he laid it out was a Wednesday night in the shop, which was where they always met. The bay cleared out for the purpose, folding chairs in a rough circle, the particular informality of a room that is usually full of machinery trying to hold a human-sized conversation. He put the materials list on the board in his own handwriting, which was the handwriting of a man who learned to write in a different era and had never entirely updated it. He put the work schedule beside it. Nobody argued about whether to do it. That conversation was already done, somehow, without having been had. The conversation that happened was the practical one. Who had what skills? Who knew whom? Who could source what at what cost? Who could get there on which day? It was a good conversation, efficient, the kind that happens when a room full of people are all pointing in the same direction. Cartwright, who had been in construction longer than most of the people in the room had been writing, ran the material list with the methodical pleasure of a man doing the thing he's actually good at. He corrected 2 of Ray's estimates and added 3 items Ray hadn't thought of. Ray said, "Good catch." Cartwright said, "That's why you bring me." It was. Rose took on the coordination with the other chapters because she was better at it than anyone else, and they all knew it, and she knew they knew it, and they were all fine with that. She had a way of telling a story that made people want to be part of it. She wasn't inflating anything. She was just accurate about what mattered. She told the story of Margaret Voss accurately, and people wanted to come. They kept coming. By the time Ray had the final count, 2 days before, he had 207 confirmed writers, and he had told Margaret nothing. He looked at the spreadsheet on his phone one more time at midnight, checked the columns, closed it, and went to bed. He slept better than he had in a long time, not because anything was solved, because something was happening. Because forward, this time, meant something specific. The morning they arrived, the weather was doing the thing that October in Oregon does after a long, wet stretch. Crisp, clear, the sky the particular deep blue that looks like it was painted by someone who wanted to get it right. Birchwood Lane, which was a quiet street on a quiet morning in a quiet town, was not prepared for what came down it at 7:45. Mrs. Patrice Newen from across the street called 911, as mentioned. What I didn't tell you is that she then stood in her doorway, still in her slippers, and watched for the full 40 minutes it took for all of the riders to arrive and park and settle and go quiet. And then she stood there for another 10 minutes after that, watching the work crews unload. And then she went inside and called her sister in Medford and told her the whole thing from the beginning. Her sister cried. Patrice said she didn't know why she was telling her. Her sister said, "Yes, you do." The next day, Patrice brought a pot of chili across the street at 4 in the afternoon. She set it on the outdoor table without announcement and went back to her house. By 5 o'clock, there were 6 people standing around the table with bowls. Nobody had asked her to do it. She just had. That's what stories do when they're real. They spread not as information, but as an impulse. The impulse to do something. The impulse that was always there, maybe, waiting for a reason to move. That chili was Patrice Newen's door. She opened it. Birchwood Lane is very quiet on winter mornings now. The yellow house at the end has a solid roof and a gray-green porch and gutters that hold. Inside, a woman gets up at 6:30 and makes coffee and reads, and sometimes calls her daughter, and sometimes calls Rose or Cartwright or Thorne, and sometimes makes calls for people she's never met, but who need connecting to something or someone that she now knows. She is not lonely. She was, for a while, in the careful, unsayable way of competent people. She is not now. She is, in the way that matters most, exactly who she always was. She just has more room for it now. More people know where the porch light is. The porch light at the end of Birchwood Lane stays on all night. It always has. It always will. Some lights are just like that. They don't need a reason. They just stay on in case someone needs to find the way.